Hi, Lou here, and I'm going to talk about the different meanings of the word war game as an illustration, I suppose, of how frequently semantics, the meanings of words, make such a big difference in how people discuss games. A word that means one thing to somebody means a different thing to somebody else. Theme is, for example, is a word that I don't use. Fun is a word that I don't use because there are almost as many meanings as there are people to the word fun. Well, in the case of war games, the big divide is that in America, usually the word war game meant a tabletop, a board game. Now, I'm talking about quite a while ago now. Sometimes it means to people video games. And in Britain, the word war game meant, and still does mean, a miniatures game where you have toy soldiers or the equivalent and you put them on a table and play a game. So when an American says war games, he's meaning one thing. When the Brit says war games, he's meaning another thing, he or she. Now, I have to admit that I've always regarded miniatures battles as not very interesting. And the reason for that is they kind of represent ancient and medieval battles. And in those battles, the commander often had little influence over what happened once he'd set up his forces. Now, in a miniatures game, you have remarkably unrealistic conditions because the commander has a great deal more influence on what happens than was true in the real world. And moreover, the commander usually has much greater information than in a real war. He can see or she can see the whole board and know where all the enemies are, unless there are rules in the miniatures rules that allow hidden maneuvers to occur and then come on the board later on. So the miniatures games have even less to do with real history than the board games do, because in board games you can introduce some fog of war. In board games, it's easier to have units show up later. And of course, another big difference here is that miniatures games almost always are about individual battles, whereas board games can be about wars. And I'm much more interested in wars and strategy than I am in battles and tactics. Now, does that mean miniatures are bad? No. But I do also see miniatures as a painting and collecting hobby more than a gaming hobby. I know my nephew at a certain age, teenage, played Warhammer, and to him it was collecting and painting miniatures. He didn't really care how he did in the actual play of the game, so his cousin always beat him. And Warhammer, I have to say, is such an unusual and outlying thing that I don't even really regard it as part of war games compared to other kinds of miniatures battles, historical miniatures battles, for example. But that's my personal opinion. And there are other people who love miniatures and love miniatures battles. Fair enough. But we have to always keep in mind what we mean when we say war games. Thanks for listening.